What happens when trust shatters and betrayal takes its place? A husband discovers his wife isn't coming home one night, but what he uncovers next is more shocking than he could ever imagine. Lies, manipulation, and an ultimate test of love and loyalty. How far would you go for the truth? Jack Merrick carefully placed the last candle on the table, its soft glow casting a warm light across the room. The scent of rosemary chicken drifted through the air, mingling with the subtle floral fragrance of Lisa's favorite wine. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second feeling heavier than the last. He checked his phone for the fourth time in 5 minutes, still no response. It was their anniversary, a day he'd circled in his mind for weeks. 10 years, a milestone. He'd planned everything meticulously. The meal, the music, the wine. He wanted it to be perfect, a moment to bridge the growing gap between them. But now, sitting at the neatly arranged table with only the soft hum of the radio for company, he couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in his chest. He opened their text thread again. His last message, sent an hour earlier, simply read, "I'm looking forward to tonight. Let me know when you're on your way." Beneath it, her reply from earlier that afternoon stared back at him. "I'm tied up with work, but I'll try to make it." Jack clenched his jaw, his mind flickering between worry and frustration. Lisa had been distant for months now, her late nights at work becoming more frequent. At first, he'd chalked it up to stress, but lately it felt different, like she was slipping away. His phone buzzed. Finally, he snatched it up, his heart lifting for a brief moment, only to have it crash back down. The message read, "Don't wait up tonight, I'm staying out." Staying out? On their anniversary? Jack stared at the words, the silence of the room pressing against him. A mixture of disbelief and anger surged through his veins. He set his phone down carefully, almost afraid it might break under the weight of his tightening grip. After a moment, he stood and walked to the kitchen, the aroma of the dinner he'd prepared mocking him. He leaned against the counter, his hands gripping the edge as he tried to steady himself. His mind raced with possibilities. Was she really working late? Or was there something she wasn't telling him? The thought of her not coming home felt like a blow to the chest. He remembered their wedding day vividly, her smile radiant as she said, "Forever." He'd believed in that word, built his life around it. Now it felt fragile, as if it could shatter at any moment. Jack turned back to the table, its beauty now feeling like a cruel joke. The flickering candles seemed to mock his effort. With a sudden burst of frustration, he blew them out one by one, each extinguished flame echoing the emotions swirling inside him. He picked up his phone again, staring at the screen. The photo of Lisa that served as his wallpaper felt like a reminder of what they used to be, a version of them he desperately missed. Against his better judgment, he opened her social media profile, hoping for some clue about her night. A tagged photo caught his eye. It was posted just minutes ago, showing Lisa at a downtown restaurant. She looked stunning in a black dress he didn't recognize, sitting across from a man Jack had never seen before. They were laughing, their glasses raised in what looked like a toast. Jack felt a knot tighten in his stomach, his breath catching in his throat. His mind screamed for answers, but all he could do was stare at the image, frozen in place. The caption read, "Celebrating New Beginnings." New beginnings? Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He zoomed in on the man, his face unfamiliar yet somehow threatening. The laughter frozen in the photo felt like a dagger. His hands trembled as he closed the app and set his phone down. For a moment he stood motionless in the dimly lit kitchen, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Then, almost instinctively, he grabbed his keys. He wasn't sure what he'd do when he got there, but he couldn't just sit at home while Lisa was out, celebrating. As he stepped into the cool night air, his mind swirled with questions. Why hadn't she told him? Who was the man? And most painfully, was their marriage already over and he was the last to know? Jack tightened his grip on the steering wheel as he drove, his knuckles white against the dark leather. The streets blurred as his thoughts raced. Whatever he found at that restaurant, he knew one thing. Tonight, everything would change. Jack pushed the front door open, the familiar creak echoing through the quiet house. The dim glow of the entryway lamp greeted him, casting long shadows against the walls. The silence felt heavier than usual, an oppressive presence that seemed to press down on his chest. He stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him, as if afraid to disturb the emptiness. The table was still set, the untouched dinner now cold. The wine glasses stood side by side, waiting for a celebration that never came. Jack stood in the doorway for a moment, staring at the scene like it belonged to someone else's life. The candles, half melted, had long since burned out. Their smoky scent lingered in the air, mixing with the aroma of the meal he had carefully prepared hours earlier. He pulled out a chair and sat down, his hands clasped tightly together. He tried to steady his breathing, but his chest felt constricted, as if the walls around him were closing in. Reaching for his phone, he opened the photo again, the one of Lisa at the restaurant. He stared at her smile, at the way her head tilted slightly toward the man sitting across from her. It was a smile he hadn't seen in months, a smile that wasn't meant for him. Jack set the phone down, his hands trembling. His thoughts raced, each one louder and more chaotic than the last. Was she unhappy? Had he missed the signs? Or worse, had she stopped loving him entirely? He pushed back his chair abruptly, the legs scraping against the hardwood floor. The sound was jarring in the stillness. He couldn't sit there anymore. Couldn't bear the sight of the untouched dinner or the accusatory silence of the house. He wandered into the living room, his eyes scanning the familiar space. It felt different now, emptier, as though Lisa's absence had drained it of warmth. His gaze landed on the bookshelf in the corner. Among the rows of novels and photo frames, a leather-bound photo album caught his attention. He hadn't opened it in years. Jack pulled it from the shelf, his fingers brushing against the dust-covered cover. He carried it to the couch, sitting down heavily as he flipped it open. The first page greeted him with a picture from their wedding day. Lisa, radiant in her white dress, holding his hand as they walked down the aisle. Her smile was brighter than the sunlight streaming through the church windows. Jack's throat tightened. He ran his fingers lightly over the photo, as though touching it might bring back the joy it captured. Page after page, the album told the story of their lives together. Their honeymoon in the mountains, the first Christmas in their house, lazy Sunday mornings spent laughing over burnt pancakes. Each image was a fragment of a life that felt so distant now, a life he wasn't sure they could ever return to. Halfway through, a folded piece of paper slipped out and fluttered to the floor. Jack reached down to pick it up, his brow furrowing as he unfolded it. The handwriting was unmistakably Lisa's, neat, slanted, and deliberate. It was a letter. His eyes scanned the words, each one landing like a punch to the gut. "I feel invisible," it began. "I don't know how we got here, but I don't feel like myself anymore. I miss the days when we laughed, when we dreamed together. Lately, I felt like I'm just going through the motions, and I'm scared of what that means for us." Jack's hands shook as he held the letter. He read it again and again, each time hearing her voice in his head. Invisible? How had he missed this? He thought back to the late nights he spent at the office, the weekends lost to work calls and deadlines. Had he really been so blind? He sank back into the couch, the letter clutched in his hand. His heart ached, a deep gnawing pain that felt impossible to shake. He wanted to be angry, wanted to blame her for drifting away, but the words in her letter wouldn't let him. They forced him to confront a truth he didn't want to face. This wasn't just her fault. He had failed too. Jack stared at the letter, the silence of the house pressing in on him again. He thought of Lisa at the restaurant, laughing, smiling, her world seemingly untouched by the weight crushing him now. For the first time that night, he allowed himself to cry. Quiet, restrained sobs that racked his body but brought no relief. As the tears slowed, a new resolve began to take shape. He folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the album. If there was even a chance to fix this, he had to try. But first, he needed to understand. He needed answers. Jack stood, the heaviness in his chest replaced by a simmering determination. The house was still silent, but now it felt less suffocating. He glanced at the clock. Midnight. Lisa wasn't coming home tonight. But when she did, Jack would be ready to ask the questions he'd been too afraid to voice. The next morning, Jack woke to the sound of his phone buzzing on the nightstand. He groggily reached for it, half hoping it was Lisa with an explanation. Instead, it was a notification from their bank. Reminder, your recent purchase at Midtown Jewelry has posted to your account. Jack sat up, his heart racing as he read the message again. Jewelry? They hadn't bought jewelry, at least not together. Confusion gave way to suspicion as he logged into their account. There it was, a charge for $1,200 at a high-end jewelry store downtown dated 3 days ago. He stared at the screen, his mind reeling. Lisa hadn't mentioned anything about buying jewelry. What was it for? Or worse, who was it for? The day ahead felt like a blur as Jack went through the motions at work. He shuffled papers, nodded along in meetings, but his thoughts kept returning to that charge. By the time his lunch break rolled around, he couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing his jacket, he left the office and drove straight to Midtown Jewelry. The store was elegant, the kind of place he and Lisa had walked past many times but never entered. The air smelled faintly of leather and polished wood, the counters gleaming under soft lights. A young saleswoman approached with a warm smile. Good afternoon. How can I help you today? Jack hesitated, his stomach churning. I'm looking for something special. My wife made a purchase here a few days ago and I wanted to surprise her by matching it with something else. Could you tell me what she bought? The saleswoman's smile faltered slightly. Let me check. She moved to a computer behind the counter, typing quickly. What's her name? Lisa Merrick. The woman's brow furrowed as she scrolled through the screen. Ah, here we go. A men's watch. She picked it up on Tuesday. Jack's pulse quickened. A men's watch? He forced a polite smile. That's great. Do you happen to remember what it looked like? Oh, absolutely, she said, beaming again. It was one of our best sellers, black leather strap, silver face, classic but stylish. She mentioned it was a gift. Jack swallowed hard, his throat dry. A gift? Yes, the woman replied cheerfully, clearly oblivious to the storm brewing inside him. She said the recipient was someone very important. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Someone very important? His mind spun with possibilities, each one worse than the last. He mumbled a thank you and left the store, his legs feeling heavy as he walked back to the car. Sitting behind the wheel, he stared at the dashboard, his thoughts racing. Who was important enough for Lisa to spend over $1,000 on? He didn't own a watch like that. In fact, he didn't even wear watches. Could it have been for her father? No, he hated jewelry. A brother? She didn't have one. That left only one other possibility, the one he couldn't bear to think about. Jack gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white. The image of Lisa and Mark at the restaurant flashed in his mind, their laughter, the way she leaned toward him. Was it for him? The thought sent a wave of nausea through Jack. He tried to calm himself, tried to rationalize it. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. Maybe. But deep down he knew better. He turned the key in the ignition and drove aimlessly, the streets of Charleston blurring past. His chest felt tight, a mix of anger, hurt, and something else he couldn't quite name. Betrayal? No, not yet. He needed more proof. But the doubt was there, growing like a shadow he couldn't escape. Jack found himself at a park near the waterfront, the waves lapping gently against the shore. He got out of the car and sat on a bench, staring out at the water. The watch wasn't the problem, he realized. It was everything it represented. The secrets, the distance, the possibility that Lisa was sharing a part of herself with someone else, a part that used to belong to him. The letter from the night before crept back into his mind. I feel invisible. He'd failed her, hadn't he? Let her slip away while he was too busy with work, with life. But did that excuse this? Did it justify lying, sneaking around, spending their money on whoever Mark was? Jack's phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. A text from Maggie. Hey, are you okay? You've been quiet today. He hesitated before replying. Not really, can we talk? Her response was immediate. Of course, come over tonight. Jack stared at the screen, his chest tightening again. He needed answers, and if Lisa wouldn't give them to him, maybe Maggie could. Jack parked his car in front of Maggie's modest home, the porch light casting a warm glow on the front steps. He sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel as if it were the only thing grounding him. His heart raced, not from fear, but from the anticipation of what Maggie might say. Could she give him answers, or would her words confirm the one thing he was too afraid to face? The door opened before he could knock. Maggie stood there, arms crossed, her expression a mix of concern and annoyance. "You look like hell," she said, motioning for him to come inside. "Thanks for the warm welcome," Jack muttered, stepping into the familiar comfort of his sister's home. The scent of fresh coffee hung in the air, and he spotted 2 mugs already sitting on the kitchen table. Maggie always knew when something was wrong. "Sit," she said firmly, closing the door behind him. Jack obeyed, sinking into the chair across from her. She slid a mug toward him, her sharp eyes scanning his face. "Start talking." Jack sighed, wrapping his hands around the warm ceramic. He wasn't sure where to begin. "It's Lisa," he finally said, his voice low. "She's been distant, and last night—" He hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "She didn't come home." Maggie's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean she didn't come home?" "She said she was working late, but she wasn't. I saw her with a man." Jack's voice cracked, and he hated himself for it. "And then this morning I found a charge on our credit card. She bought a watch for him." Maggie's expression hardened. She took a slow sip of her coffee, her silence unnerving. "I didn't want to say anything," she began cautiously, "but I saw her with someone a few weeks ago." Jack's stomach dropped. "What? Where?" "At the theater gala downtown. I was there with some friends. I saw Lisa and that man. They looked close." Maggie's words were carefully measured, but the weight of them hit Jack like a ton of bricks. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded, his voice rising. Maggie flinched but held her ground. "What was I supposed to say? Hey, Jack, I saw your wife with another man? I didn't know for sure what was going on, and honestly, I didn't think it was my place." Jack stood abruptly, pacing the small kitchen. His thoughts raced, colliding with each other in a chaotic mess. "She said she feels invisible," he muttered, half to himself. "Like I've been ignoring her. But that doesn't justify—" He stopped, shaking his head. "Who is this guy, Maggie? What do you know about him?" Maggie hesitated, her fingers tapping against her mug. "I don't know much. His name's Mark, I think. He's a theater director. Charming in that smug, too-good-for-everyone kind of way. Honestly, he gave me a bad feeling." Jack's jaw clenched. Mark. The name felt like a splinter in his mind, sharp and irritating. "What kind of bad feeling?" "The kind that makes you keep your distance," Maggie said flatly. "There's something off about him. Too smooth, too calculated. Like he knows exactly what to say to get what he wants." Jack's fists tightened at his sides. "And Lisa fell for it," he said bitterly. "Jack," Maggie said, her voice softening, "you need to think about what you're going to do next. Confronting her without a plan isn't going to fix this." "Fix this?" Jack laughed bitterly. "How do you fix something like this, Maggie? She lied to me. She bought him a damn watch. I don't even know who she is anymore." Maggie stood, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. "You'll figure it out. But first you need to talk to her, not to accuse her, not to yell, but to understand. If there's even a chance of saving this, you owe it to yourself to try." Jack looked away, his jaw tight. "And if I don't want to save it, then at least you'll know you tried," Maggie said firmly. "But don't make any decisions until you've heard her side, even if it hurts." Jack sat back down, his head in his hands. The weight of Maggie's words settled heavily on his shoulders. She was right. He needed to talk to Lisa, but the thought of facing her, of hearing whatever truth she had to share, terrified him. What if it was worse than he imagined? Maggie pulled a piece of paper from a notepad on the counter and slid it toward him. "Here," she said. "Mark's name and the theater he works at. If you want answers, this is where you start." Jack stared at the paper, his heart pounding in his chest. He folded it carefully and tucked it into his pocket, the decision already forming in his mind. He would talk to Lisa, but first he needed to see Mark for himself. Jack parked his car across the street from the cafe Maggie had mentioned. The bright lettering on the window read, Charleston Beanery, a cozy, bustling spot he and Lisa used to visit together. It had been years since their last trip here, back when life felt simpler. when they laughed over cappuccinos and shared dreams for the future. Now those memories felt like they belonged to someone else. He adjusted his rearview mirror, his gaze fixed on the cafe's entrance. The late morning sun streamed through the glass, casting warm light on the tables inside. Jack scanned the patrons, his stomach tightening with each passing second. Then he saw her. Lisa stepped into view, her dark hair falling perfectly over her shoulders. She looked radiant, wearing a dress Jack didn't recognize. She smiled as she slid into a seat across from a man. Mark. Jack recognized him immediately from Maggie's description, confident, polished, exuding a charm that felt calculated rather than genuine. Jack's hands tightened around the steering wheel as he watched them. Lisa laughed, leaning slightly toward Mark as he gestured animatedly. The easy way they interacted sent a sharp pang through Jack's chest. It wasn't just the laughter. It was how comfortable she seemed, how free. He could have stayed in the car, observing from a distance, but something inside him snapped. He couldn't sit by and do nothing. He grabbed his phone, slid it into his pocket, and stepped out of the car. The sound of his shoes hitting the pavement felt too loud, too final, but he didn't stop. His legs carried him forward, his heart pounding in his ears. The cafe door chimed softly as he entered. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, mingling with the soft murmur of conversations. Lisa didn't notice him at first. She was too engrossed in whatever Mark was saying, her hand resting lightly on the table between them. Jack cleared his throat, his voice barely audible. Lisa. Her head whipped around, her eyes widening as she saw him. Jack? She stammered, her smile vanishing in an instant. Mark turned, his expression unreadable but calm. Too calm. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms casually as if this were a routine encounter. You must be Jack, he said smoothly, his voice dripping with confidence. Lisa's told me about you. Jack ignored him, his focus solely on Lisa. What's going on? He asked, his voice tight. Why are you here? Lisa opened her mouth to respond, but Mark cut in. We're just having a meeting, nothing to worry about. Stay out of this, Jack snapped, his eyes never leaving Lisa. I'm asking her. Lisa hesitated, her hands fidgeting in her lap. Jack, it's not what you think, she said finally. Mark's a client. We were discussing a project. A project, Jack repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. Is that what the watch was for? Part of the project? Lisa's face turned pale, her eyes darting toward Mark, who still wore that infuriatingly calm expression. Jack, I can explain, she began, but Jack held up a hand. Don't, he said, his voice low. I'm not here to hear excuses. I'm here because I deserve the truth. Mark stood, adjusting his jacket. I think I'll give you two some privacy, he said smoothly. It's clear you have a lot to talk about. No, Jack said sharply, his gaze snapping to Mark. You stay. If this involves you, I want to hear it from both of you. Mark smirked, shrugging as he sat back down. Fair enough. Lisa looked between the two men, her shoulders slumping under the weight of the moment. Jack, she said softly, her voice trembling. I didn't want it to be like this. Like what, Lisa? Jack asked, his frustration boiling over. What exactly is this? For a moment, silence hung between them, the tension so thick it felt suffocating. Lisa finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. It's complicated, Mark chuckled, shaking his head. Complicated is one word for it. Shut up, Jack snapped, his patience wearing thin. He turned back to Lisa. Is he the reason you've been distant? The reason you didn't come home last night? Lisa opened her mouth, but the words didn't come. Her silence was answer enough. Jack felt his chest tighten, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The cafe, the people, the noise, it all faded into the background as the weight of her betrayal settled over him. I need some air, Jack muttered, stepping back from the table. He didn't wait for a response. The cafe door chimed again as he pushed it open, the cool breeze hitting his face like a slap. He stood on the sidewalk, his hands shaking, his mind a chaotic mess of anger and heartbreak. Behind him, he heard the door open again. He turned, expecting Lisa, but it was Mark. The man approached with an infuriatingly casual stride, stopping just a few feet away. You know, Mark began, his tone almost mocking, if you'd paid more attention, maybe she wouldn't have needed me. Jack's fist clenched at his side, his body trembling with the effort to hold back. "Get out of my sight," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. Mark smirked again, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Just saying, think about it." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Jack standing there, his world unraveling around him. The house was eerily quiet when Jack returned, the kind of silence that felt louder than any noise. He tossed his keys onto the kitchen counter, the metallic clink echoing through the empty space. The encounter at the cafe still played on a loop in his mind. Lisa's silence, Mark's smugness, the undeniable truth that his marriage was slipping through his fingers. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to breathe. Jack paced the living room, his eyes darting to the bookshelf in the corner. His thoughts swirled, a chaotic mess of anger, confusion, and something else, something raw and hollow. His gaze landed on the box at the bottom of the shelf, an old wooden chest Lisa had brought with her when they first moved in. It hadn't been touched in years. Without thinking, he crouched down and pulled it out. The lid creaked as he opened it, revealing a collection of keepsakes. Old movie tickets, postcards, a pressed flower from their honeymoon. Each item felt like a shard of glass, sharp and painful against the memories they once represented. But nestled beneath it all was a small leather journal. Jack hesitated, his fingers hovering over the worn cover. He hadn't seen Lisa write in years, not since college. Slowly, he picked it up and opened to the first page. The date was from 6 months ago. "I don't know where to start," the entry began. "Everything feels so heavy. I love Jack, but I don't feel like myself anymore. It's like I'm disappearing bit by bit and he doesn't even notice." Jack's heart clenched as he read the words. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, neat and deliberate. He turned the page, each sentence pulling him deeper into a side of Lisa he hadn't seen or hadn't wanted to see. "I try to tell myself it's just a phase," one entry read, "that we'll find our way back to each other. But every time I look at him, I feel like a stranger, and I hate myself for it." His hands shook as he flipped to another page. The date was just 2 weeks ago. "Mark listens. He sees me. I know it's wrong, but for the first time in years, I feel alive. He doesn't judge me. He just listens." The words blurred as Jack's vision clouded with tears. He slammed the journal shut, his chest heaving as he tried to process what he'd just read. It wasn't just betrayal. It was a slow unraveling of the life they'd built together, piece by painful piece. He wanted to be angry, to hate her for turning to someone else. But as the silence of the house pressed in around him, all he could feel was the weight of his own failures. He'd been so focused on providing, on being the husband he thought she needed, that he hadn't seen her slipping away. Jack leaned back against the couch, the journal still clutched in his hands. His mind raced, replaying the moments he'd missed, the nights she'd gone to bed early, the days she'd barely spoken a word. He'd chalked it up to stress, to the natural ebb and flow of a long marriage. But now, those moments felt like flashing warning signs he'd ignored. He opened the journal again, his eyes scanning the next entry. "I want to tell him. I want to scream at him, cry, beg him to see me. But every time I try, the words catch in my throat. What if he doesn't care? What if he's happier this way?" Jack exhaled sharply, the words hitting him like a punch to the gut. He closed the journal again, setting it carefully on the coffee table. For a long moment, he sat there, staring at nothing, his thoughts a tangled mess of guilt and resolve. He couldn't ignore it anymore. Lisa was broken. Their marriage was broken. And while Mark's presence infuriated him, Jack knew the real fight wasn't with him. It was with the silence, the walls they'd built between them over the years. Walls he hadn't even realized were there. Jack stood, the weight in his chest shifting slightly. He didn't know if their marriage could be saved, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. He needed answers, and this time, he wouldn't settle for half-truths or silence. As he headed upstairs, the journal still on the table behind him, Jack's mind was already turning over the next steps. He needed to talk to Lisa, and this time, he wouldn't let her avoid the truth. Jack stood outside the cafe for a long moment, the cool evening air biting against his skin. The tension in his chest hadn't eased since his confrontation with Lisa and Mark earlier in the day. Every word, every gesture still burned vividly in his mind. He was angry, sure, but beneath that anger was something worse. Doubt. Doubt in her. Doubt in himself. Doubt in everything they had built together. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out to see an unfamiliar number. For a moment he considered ignoring it, but something told him to answer. "Hello!" Jack's voice came out sharper than he intended. "Jack Merrick." The voice on the other end was cautious, almost hesitant. "Who's asking?" "It's Sarah, Sarah Carter. I work with Lisa. We met at the holiday party last year, briefly." Jack frowned, trying to place her. "Right, what do you want?" There was a pause, long enough that Jack almost hung up. I think you need to know what's going on," Sarah finally said, her voice trembling slightly. Jack's grip tightened on the phone. "I'm listening." "Look, I wasn't going to get involved," she continued, her words rushing out now. "It's not my place and I didn't want to make things worse, but Mark isn't who you think he is. And Lisa, she doesn't know what she's gotten herself into." "What are you talking about?" Jack demanded, his pulse quickening. "Mark Thatcher," Sarah said, the name laced with disdain. "He's not just some charming theater director. He's manipulative. He finds people when they're vulnerable and he uses them." Jack felt a knot form in his stomach. "What do you mean uses them?" "He's done it before," Sarah said. "I know because it happened to me." Jack's breath caught. "You?" "It was a couple of years ago," Sarah admitted, her voice heavy with shame. "He said all the right things, made me feel seen, made me trust him. And then when I was too deep to see it coming, he used me to get what he wanted. Money, favors, connections, whatever benefited him. And when I finally realized what was happening, he disappeared. No apology, no explanation. Just gone." Jack's hand tightened around the phone. "Why didn't you warn her?" "I tried," Sarah said quickly. "I hinted, but she didn't want to hear it. Mark has this way of making you believe you're the exception, like he really cares about you. By the time you figure out the truth, it's too late." Jack leaned against the side of his car, his mind racing. He thought of Lisa's journal, her descriptions of Mark's understanding and attentiveness. "Does she know about this? About what he's done?" "I doubt it," Sarah replied. "Mark's careful. He knows how to cover his tracks. But I've seen the way he looks at her, the way he isolates her. It's the same pattern. He'll keep pulling her in until she can't see anything else, and then he'll—" "Stop!" Jack interrupted, his voice hard. "What do you expect me to do with this?" "Talk to her," Sarah said, desperation creeping into her tone. "Make her see who he really is before it's too late. I'm telling you because I know what it's like to feel trapped, and I don't want that for her, or for you." Jack closed his eyes, the weight of her words pressing down on him. "Why now? Why tell me this now?" "Because I saw you today," Sarah admitted, "at the cafe. I saw the way you looked at her and I couldn't just stay quiet. You need to know what you're dealing with." Jack exhaled sharply, the knot in his stomach tightening further. "And how exactly am I supposed to make her see it? She's already—" His voice trailed off, the words too painful to say. "Show her the truth," Sarah urged. "Find proof. Mark always leaves a trail if you know where to look. I can help." Jack hesitated. He didn't trust her, didn't trust anyone right now. But if there was even a chance she was telling the truth, he couldn't ignore it. "Fine," he said finally. "What do you have?" "I'll send you some names," Sarah said. "People who've crossed paths with Mark, people who've been burned by him. Talk to them, connect the dots." Jack felt a flicker of resolve, faint but growing. "If you're lying about this—" "I'm not," Sarah cut in, her voice firm. "Just be careful, Jack. Mark isn't just some guy who stole your wife's attention. He's dangerous." The line went dead, leaving Jack standing alone under the streetlight. Dangerous. The word echoed in his mind as he slipped his phone back into his pocket. This wasn't just about an affair anymore. It was about something much bigger, something darker. And if Sarah was right, Lisa was in deeper trouble than she realized. Jack climbed into his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly as he stared out into the night. The truth felt closer now, just out of reach. But one thing was clear, this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Jack barely had time to process Sarah's warning before the next blow landed. The The following day, he returned home from work to find an envelope sitting on the dining table. No return address, just his name scrawled in bold, uneven handwriting. The air in the room felt heavier as he picked it up, the faint scent of cologne clinging to the paper. He tore it open with shaking hands. Inside was a single photograph, Lisa and Mark, sitting close together on a park bench, their heads bent as though sharing a secret. On the back, a message was scrawled in the same sharp handwriting. "Back off, or you'll regret it." Jack stared at the photo, his breath catching in his throat. His pulse pounded in his ears as anger surged through him, hot and immediate. This wasn't just about Lisa anymore. This was personal. Mark wasn't just playing games, he was escalating. The door creaked open, and Jack turned sharply to see Lisa stepping inside. She froze when she saw the photo in his hand, her face going pale. "What is that?" she whispered. "You tell me," Jack shot back, holding up the picture. "This showed up today. Care to explain?" Lisa's eyes widened as she stepped closer, her hands trembling. "I didn't know about this," she said quickly. "Jack, I swear I didn't." "Don't lie to me," Jack cut in, his voice hard. "I've had enough of lies. Is this how far you're willing to let him go? Threatening me?" "I didn't know," Lisa repeated, her voice breaking. She sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. "I didn't think it would get this bad." Jack slammed the photo onto the table, the sound making her flinch. "Then tell me, Lisa. How bad is it? What else aren't you telling me?" Her shoulders shook as she exhaled a ragged breath. "He's not who I thought he was," she admitted. "At first he was different, kind. He listened. But now he's controlling. He's been pressuring me to leave, saying he'll take care of everything, that you don't deserve me." Jack felt his stomach twist. "And you believed him?" "I was confused," Lisa shouted, her voice trembling with frustration and shame. "I didn't know what to do, Jack. I was so angry at you, so lost. And he was there saying all the right things, but now he's not letting go. He said if I don't leave you, he'll—" Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands again. Jack's chest tightened. "He'll what?" Lisa looked up at him, her eyes red and glassy. "He said he'd ruin us, both of us. He has photos, texts, things he said he'd show the world if I didn't leave. He's blackmailing me." The room spun for a moment as Jack tried to process her words. Anger, betrayal, and fear collided inside him. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" "I was scared," Lisa admitted. "I thought I could handle it, that I could talk him down, but now I don't know what to do." Jack leaned on the table, his hands braced against its edge. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, suffocating. Mark wasn't just an affair anymore. He was a threat, a dangerous, calculated threat that could destroy everything. "We're not handling this his way," Jack said finally, his voice low and steady. "He wants to ruin us? Fine, let him try, but we're going to fight back." Lisa shook her head, fresh tears streaming down her face. "Jack, you don't know what he's capable of. He's dangerous." "I don't care," Jack said firmly. He walked around the table, kneeling in front of her. "Lisa, listen to me. I'm not letting him win. He doesn't get to control you, and he sure as hell doesn't get to control me." Lisa sobbed quietly, her head nodding slightly as she clutched his hands. For the first time in months, there was no distance between them, only the shared weight of their pain and the faint glimmer of a united front. As Jack stood, his resolve hardened. Mark had crossed a line. It wasn't just about saving his marriage anymore. It was about protecting the life they'd built, no matter how broken it felt now. He grabbed his phone and dialed Maggie's number. "We need to talk," he said when she answered. "It's about Mark." The night was still, the kind of silence that felt alive, pressing against the walls of their home. Jack sat on the edge of the couch, his elbows on his knees, staring at Lisa. She sat across from him, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, as though trying to hold together what little composure she had left. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed red from tears that hadn't stopped since their earlier confrontation. "Start from the beginning," Jack said, his voice low but firm. "No more half-truths, no more lies. I need to know everything." Lisa nodded, but the words didn't come immediately. She looked down at her hands, twisting them together nervously. I didn't plan for this, she began softly. I didn't wake up one day and decide to ruin our marriage. Then what did you plan for? Jack asked, his tone sharper than he intended. Lisa flinched, and he immediately regretted it. Just talk, he added, softening his voice. Please. She took a shaky breath. It started at the theater gala last year. I was there for a client meeting, and Mark, he was charming, attentive. You know how distant we'd been, how many nights we went to bed without saying a word to each other. He noticed me in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. Jack's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent, letting her continue. I didn't think it was a big deal at first, she said. Just conversations, compliments. But then it turned into lunch meetings, then drinks after work. And before I knew it, I was confiding in him about us. Us. Jack's voice broke slightly. You told him about us? I told him how invisible I felt, Lisa admitted, her voice trembling, how lonely I was. And he used it, Jack. He made me believe he understood, that he cared. But it wasn't real. I see that now. Jack leaned back, his head resting against the couch, eyes staring at the ceiling. The knot in his chest tightened with every word she said. So, what changed? He asked. If he's so manipulative, why are you still tied to him? Lisa wiped at her tears, her voice thick with emotion. Because I didn't realize what he was until it was too late. At first, he was supportive, encouraging. But then he started asking for favors. Little things, introductions to clients, recommendations for his work. And when I hesitated, he started using what I told him against me. Jack sat up, his attention snapping back to her. What do you mean? He recorded our conversations, Lisa whispered. Texts, emails, photos, everything. He said if I didn't help him, he'd send them to you, or worse, to my clients. He'd ruin my career, my reputation. Ruin you? Jack repeated, the anger in his voice barely restrained. Why didn't you come to me? Lisa's laugh was bitter, a sound that cut through the tension like a blade. Because I thought you'd hate me, and part of me felt like I deserved it, for letting him in, for not stopping it sooner. Jack shook his head, his emotions a tangled mess. So what now? Are you just going to let him keep holding this over you? No, Lisa said firmly, meeting his gaze for the first time. I'm done letting him control me. I want to fight back, Jack, but I don't know how. Her words hung in the air, a fragile plea wrapped in guilt and desperation. Jack stood, pacing the room as he tried to gather his thoughts. He wanted to yell, to scream at her for the lies, for the choices that had led them here. But he couldn't ignore the fear in her voice or the pain etched into her face. You said he recorded you, Jack said finally, his tone steady. Do you know where he keeps the recordings? Lisa shook her head. No, but he's careless sometimes. He doesn't think I notice, but he's always on his laptop or his phone. He keeps everything close. Jack stopped pacing, his mind already turning over a plan. Then we find it. We get the proof, and we use it against him. Lisa's eyes widened. Jack, he's dangerous. If he finds out, I don't care. Jack interrupted, his voice hard. I'm not letting him do this to you, to us. He doesn't get to win. Lisa stood, crossing the room to stand in front of him. Her hand reached out hesitantly, brushing against his arm. I'm sorry, she whispered, for everything. I don't know if you'll ever forgive me, but I'm so sorry. Jack looked down at her, the anger in his chest softening ever so slightly. This isn't just about forgiveness, Lisa. It's about taking back control. You're not doing this alone. Her tears started again, but this time they weren't just tears of guilt. They were tears of relief. Jack placed a hand on her shoulder, the gesture small but enough to let her know he wasn't giving up on her just yet. We'll figure this out, he said quietly. Together. Jack pulled into Maggie's driveway, the gravel crunching under the tires. The house was dark except for a light in the kitchen window. He sat in the car for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Lisa's confession still weighed heavily on him, but the faint ember of resolve burned brighter with every passing moment. He needed an ally, someone who wasn't caught in the storm. Maggie was that person. The door opened before he could knock. Maggie stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her sharp eyes scanning his face. "You look like hell," she said, motioning him inside. "Thanks," Jack muttered, stepping past her. The warmth of the house was comforting, but the tension in his chest didn't ease. "I need your help." Maggie nodded, leading him to the kitchen table. "Lisa called me," she said as they sat. "She told me everything, or at least what she thought I needed to hear." Jack leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "Then you know how bad this is." "Yeah," Maggie said, her voice firm. "And you're not handling it alone. I've been doing some digging." Jack frowned. "What kind of digging?" Maggie reached for her laptop on the counter, opening it with a practiced motion. "I ran Mark's name through some connections I have. He's got a reputation, Jack. The guy's been moving from city to city for years, leaving a trail of broken lives behind him. Lawsuits, failed businesses, accusations of fraud, but nothing ever sticks." Jack's stomach turned. "Why not?" "Because he's good," Maggie said, her tone laced with frustration. "He knows exactly how to manipulate people, how to cover his tracks. But this time he slipped." She turned the laptop toward Jack, showing him an email chain. "One of his former victims agreed to talk to me, a woman named Clara. She said Mark ran the same playbook on her, charming, manipulative, and then controlling. He drained her savings, ruined her reputation, and disappeared." Jack stared at the screen, his fists clenching. "So what do we do? How do we stop him?" Maggie leaned closer, her voice dropping. "We get proof. Clara mentioned a storage unit he used to keep documents, contracts, photos, recordings. If he's still operating the same way, he'll have something similar here." Jack's eyes narrowed. "And how do we find it?" "That's the tricky part," Maggie admitted. "But Lisa might know more than she realizes. If she's seen him using a laptop or going off to certain places, it could lead us to what we need." Jack exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "This feels like a long shot." "It is," Maggie said, her expression unyielding. "But it's better than nothing. And if we don't act now, he'll destroy her. And you." Jack's jaw tightened. "I'll talk to her." "Good," Maggie said, sitting back. "But we're going to need more than just her memory. We need to track him." "How?" Maggie smirked, reaching into a drawer and pulling out a small device. "GPS tracker. I'll plant it on his car. Once we know where he goes, we can start connecting the dots." Jack stared at the device, his mind racing. "This is risky, Maggie. If he catches on—" "He won't," she interrupted. "Mark's arrogant. He thinks he's untouchable. That's his blind spot, and we're going to use it." Jack nodded slowly, the weight of the plan settling over him. "When do we start?" "Tomorrow," Maggie said. "I've already scoped out the theater. He parks in the same spot every day. I'll handle the tracker. You focus on Lisa. Get her to remember anything that might help us." Jack stood, his resolve hardening. "Thank you, Maggie." She grabbed his arm, her expression softening. "We're family, Jack. You don't need to thank me. Just promise me you'll be careful. Mark's not just playing games, he's dangerous." "I know," Jack said quietly. "But so are we." Jack stood by the kitchen counter, staring blankly at the phone in his hand. Maggie's GPS tracker was in place, and for the first time in days, they had a tangible plan. But something didn't sit right. It wasn't just the anxiety about Mark's next move or the weight of Lisa's confession. It was the gnawing feeling that they were missing something. The phone buzzed in his hand, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was Maggie. "Jack," she said without preamble, her voice tense. "We have a problem." Jack's stomach dropped. "What is it?" "Sarah," Maggie said flatly. "She's not on our side." "What are you talking about?" Jack demanded, pacing the room. "I just got off the phone with Clara," Maggie continued. "She said Sarah worked with Mark on another con years ago. It's how he got away with it. She played both sides, pretending to help the victims while feeding Mark information." Jack's grip on the phone tightened. "Are you saying she's been playing us this whole time?" "I don't know for sure," Maggie admitted, "but think about it. She conveniently finds you at the cafe just when you're starting to suspect Mark. And then she offers to help? It's too perfect." Jack's mind raced, connecting the dots. Sarah had been the one to point him toward Mark's past victims. She'd urged him to dig deeper to gather proof. But what if it was all part of Mark's plan? What if she was leading him into a trap? "Do you think she told him about the tracker?" Jack asked, his voice tight. "It's possible," Maggie said. "We need to be careful. If she's feeding him information, he'll know exactly what we're doing. Jack swore under his breath. The walls felt like they were closing in. Every step forward seemed to uncover another layer of betrayal, another person he couldn't trust. "I'll handle Sarah," Maggie said firmly. "You focus on Lisa. We need to figure out if she's seen anything that could lead us to Mark's stash. And Jack, don't let Sarah know we're on to her, not yet." "Got it," Jack muttered, ending the call. He set the phone down and took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The sound of the front door opening made him turn. Lisa stepped inside, her expression weary but resolute. "I remembered something," she said, closing the door behind her. Jack crossed the room in 2 strides. "What is it?" "Mark has a storage unit," Lisa said. "I overheard him talking about it on the phone once. He said something about keeping everything safe there." Jack's pulse quickened. "Do you know where it is?" Lisa shook her head. "No, but he mentioned the name Harborview. It's a storage facility downtown." "Harborview," Jack repeated, filing the name away. "That's a start." Lisa hesitated, her hands twisting nervously. "Jack, there's something else. Sarah called me this morning." Jack's chest tightened. "What did she say?" "She wanted to know if you were planning anything," Lisa said carefully. "She said she could help, but it didn't feel right. I didn't tell her anything." Jack exhaled, relief mingling with frustration. "Good. Don't trust her. She's not on our side." Lisa's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" Jack explained what Maggie had uncovered, watching as Lisa's expression shifted from shock to fear. "If she's working with Mark," Lisa said quietly, "then he knows everything." "Not everything," Jack said, determination hardening his voice. "But we need to move fast. If Mark thinks he's losing control, he'll act." Lisa nodded, her fear giving way to a flicker of resolve. "I'll help, whatever you need." Jack placed a hand on her shoulder, squeezing gently. "We'll figure this out. Together." Before Lisa could respond, Jack's phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen. It was Maggie. "They know about the tracker," she said the moment he answered. "Mark's car is on the move, but it's erratic. He's trying to throw us off." Jack clenched his jaw. "Stay on him. I'll meet you downtown." He ended the call and turned to Lisa. "Get anything you can remember about that storage unit, details, names, anything. I'll call you when I know more." Lisa nodded, her expression determined. "Be careful, Jack." "I will," he promised, grabbing his keys. As he stepped outside, the cool night air hit him, sharpening his focus. The betrayal cut deep, but it also fueled his resolve. He wasn't just fighting for Lisa anymore. He was fighting for the truth, for their future, and for a chance to finally stop Mark once and for all. The dim glow of the dashboard illuminated Jack's tense face as he drove toward Harborview Storage. The silence in the car was deafening, broken only by the occasional crackle of Maggie's voice through the phone. "He's circling downtown," Maggie reported. "It looks like he's trying to lose a tail. I'll keep tracking, but you need to move quickly." "I'm almost there," Jack said, gripping the steering wheel tighter. His mind raced with possibilities. If Mark's storage unit held what they needed, proof, leverage, something, it could finally tip the scales. But if they were wrong, Jack shook the thought away. He couldn't afford to doubt. As the storage facility came into view, Jack slowed, parking a block away. The area was quiet, the orange glow of streetlights casting long shadows across the rows of locked units. He glanced at the small piece of paper Lisa had scribbled on earlier. Unit C-17. It was their only lead. Jack slipped out of the car, the cold night air biting at his skin. He pulled his jacket tighter as he approached the gate. A quick glance confirmed what he feared. Keypad entry. His heart sank. Breaking in wasn't part of the plan, but he couldn't turn back now. Pulling out his phone, Jack called Maggie. "I'm at the gate. Keypad locked." "Figures," Maggie muttered. "Hold on." He heard typing on her end, the faint hum of determination in her voice. "I can try to hack it remotely, but it's going to take time." "Do it," Jack said, glancing over his shoulder. Every second felt like an hour as he waited, his ears straining for any sound. Finally, the lock clicked, and the gate creaked open. "You're in," Maggie said. "Hurry." Jack moved quickly, his footsteps muffled by the gravel. The rows of units stretched endlessly, each one identical to the last. His heart pounded as he reached C-17. He crouched by the lock, a heavy-duty padlock that mocked him with its simplicity. He was about to call Maggie again when a voice stopped him cold. "Looking for something?" Jack froze. He turned slowly to see Mark standing a few feet away, a smug smile on his face. The shadows exaggerated his features, making him look more menacing than ever. "How did you—" Jack started, but Mark cut him off. "You think I didn't notice?" Mark sneered. "The tracker, the questions." "You've been sloppy, Jack." Jack straightened, his fists clenching. "What's in the unit, Mark?" Mark chuckled, stepping closer. "Wouldn't you like to know? Too bad you'll never get the chance." Jack's mind raced. He was unarmed, outmaneuvered, but he refused to back down. "You can't keep this up," he said, his voice steady. "You've pushed too far. It's only a matter of time before someone else catches on." Mark smirked. "Oh, Jack, you're playing checkers in a chess game. I've been at this for years. You think you can stop me with— what? A hunch? A few tearful confessions from Lisa?" Jack stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "I don't need Lisa to stop you. I just need proof, and I'll find it." Mark's expression darkened, the smugness slipping for a moment. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" "Neither do you," Jack shot back. The tension crackled in the air between them, neither man willing to back down. Finally, Mark laughed, stepping away. "Fine, open it," he said, gesturing to the unit. "See what happens." Jack hesitated. Was this a trap? But he didn't have a choice. He pulled out his phone and dialed Lisa. "I need you to confirm something," he said quickly. "When you saw Mark using this place, did he ever mention cameras?" Lisa's voice was shaky. No cameras, but Jack, you need to be careful. Please." Jack hung up and turned back to Mark. "Whatever's in here," he said, "ends tonight." Mark's grin returned, but it was colder now. "Be my guest." With a deep breath, Jack unlocked the padlock and slid the door open. The inside was dimly lit, rows of boxes and files stacked neatly. It looked unassuming, almost mundane, until Jack noticed the laptops on the far side, their screens glowing faintly. He stepped inside, his pulse racing. "This is it," he muttered to himself. He reached for the nearest laptop, opening it to see folders labeled with names, some he recognized, many he didn't. This was the proof. But before he could dig further, Mark's voice rang out. "You shouldn't have done that." Jack barely had time to turn before he felt the sharp pain at the back of his head. Darkness consumed him as he fell to the ground, Mark's cold laughter the last thing he heard. Pain throbbed at the back of Jack's head as he came to. The cold, hard floor of the storage unit pressed against his cheek. Groaning, he blinked against the dim light, his surroundings swimming into focus. Mark was crouched near the laptops, a smug expression on his face as he tapped on the keyboard. "Rise and shine," Mark said, his tone laced with mockery. "I was wondering how long it would take you to wake up." Jack pushed himself up slowly, his muscles protesting. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Cleaning up," Mark replied casually. "Can't have you snooping around, can I? You're lucky I didn't leave you unconscious in the middle of the street. But then, where's the fun in that?" Jack's eyes darted around the unit, his mind racing. He needed to stall, to find a way to stop Mark from erasing the evidence. "You're scared," he said, forcing his voice to stay steady. "You wouldn't be wiping those files if you weren't." Mark smirked, shaking his head. "Scared? Of you? Don't flatter yourself. This is just routine maintenance." Jack shifted, his hand brushing against his pocket. His phone was still there. He fought to keep his expression neutral. "You can't outrun this forever," he said. "People like you always slip up." Mark's grin widened. "You mean like you did walking straight into my trap? Face it, Jack, you're out of your depth." As Mark's attention returned to the laptop, Jack slipped his hand into his pocket and pressed the call button for Maggie. He hoped she was still nearby, still tracking. The faint buzz of the connected line gave him a sliver of hope. "You think you're untouchable," Jack said, raising his voice slightly to ensure Maggie could hear. "But you're not. You've made enemies, Mark. People who won't stop until you're held accountable." Mark chuckled, leaning back against the desk. "That's cute, but I've been doing this for years, Jack. I know the game better than anyone. And trust me, you don't have what it takes to win." Jack's fingers tightened into fists. Maybe not, he admitted. But I don't need to beat you. I just need to slow you down. Mark's brow furrowed slightly, the first crack in his confident facade. Before he could respond, the faint sound of footsteps echoed from outside the unit. Jack's heart raced. Maggie was here. Mark heard it too. He straightened, his eyes narrowing as he reached for the door. Who's there? The door burst open before he could react, and two uniformed officers stormed inside, weapons drawn. Mark Thatcher, one of them barked. Step away from the desk and put your hands where we can see them. Mark froze, his smirk disappearing as his gaze darted between the officers and Jack. You called the cops? He hissed, his tone dripping with disbelief. Jack stood slowly, his head still pounding. You said I didn't have what it takes, he said, his voice steady, but I'm not doing this alone. Mark hesitated for a split second before lunging toward the laptops, his hand outstretched. Don't move, one of the officers shouted. But Mark didn't stop. The sound of a taser crackled through the air and Mark collapsed to the floor, his body convulsing briefly before going still. Jack let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The officers moved quickly, securing Mark in handcuffs and pulling him to his feet. One of them turned to Jack. Are you okay, sir? Jack nodded, though his legs felt unsteady. The laptops, he said, pointing to the desk. They have everything. Files, names, evidence of what he's done. The officer nodded, moving to secure the devices. Maggie appeared in the doorway, her expression a mix of relief and determination. Took you long enough, Jack muttered, a weak smile tugging at his lips. I had to make sure the cops were ready, Maggie replied, her voice sharp but laced with affection. She stepped closer, placing a steadying hand on his arm. You okay? I will be, Jack said, his gaze shifting to Mark. The man glared at him, his face twisted in anger. But for the first time there was something else there, fear. As the officers led Mark away, Jack turned to Maggie. It's not over yet. He still has leverage on Lisa. Maggie nodded. We'll deal with that. But tonight, you won. Jack exhaled, the weight on his chest lifting just slightly. It wasn't over, but it was a start. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains as Lisa sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of untouched coffee. Her face was pale, the weight of the last few days etched deeply into her features. Across from her, Maggie leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, her sharp gaze never leaving Lisa. You need to decide, Maggie said bluntly, if you're ready to do what it takes to end this. Lisa nodded, though her hands trembled. I am, she said softly, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. For Jack. For us. Maggie's expression softened, but her tone remained firm. Good. Then you need to take control of your story before Mark can use it against you. Lisa swallowed hard, her mind racing. The evidence on Mark's laptops was a critical blow to his operations, but it wasn't enough to shield her from the damage he could still cause. His threats loomed large in her mind. Photos, recordings, texts, all weapons in his arsenal, ready to destroy her life. The sound of the front door opening broke her thoughts. Jack entered, his face lined with exhaustion but lit with a quiet determination. He walked to the table, setting down a small stack of papers. What's this? Lisa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Options, Jack replied. Legal advice from the officers last night. They're willing to cut a deal if you testify, but they need you to tell the whole truth, Lisa. Everything. Lisa's breath hitched. The idea of standing in court, of exposing her mistakes to the world, terrified her. But the alternative, letting Mark win, was worse. She glanced at Maggie, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. I'll do it, Lisa said, her voice firm. I'll testify. Jack's shoulders sagged in relief, but he quickly straightened, his protective instincts kicking in. This won't be easy, he warned. Mark won't go down quietly, but if we stick together, we can do this, Lisa finished, meeting his gaze. For the first time in months, there was a flicker of hope between them. The next few days passed in a blur of preparations. Lisa met with detectives, recounting every detail of her interactions with Mark. Each retelling felt like a fresh wound, but she pushed through, knowing it was the only way to reclaim her life. Jack was by her side through it all, his quiet support steadying her in moments when she felt like breaking. Finally, the day of the preliminary hearing arrived. The courthouse loomed large and imposing as they approached, its stone steps seeming to stretch endlessly upward. Lisa's heart pounded as they entered, the cold air inside wrapping around her like a vice. The courtroom was packed, the atmosphere tense. Mark sat at the defendant's table, his demeanor calm but his eyes sharp and calculating. He didn't look at Lisa as she took the stand, but she felt his presence like a weight pressing down on her chest. She gripped the edges of the witness stand, her palms clammy. The prosecutor's voice was steady and reassuring as he guided her through her testimony. She spoke of how she met Mark, of how he slowly gained her trust, and of the moment she realized she was trapped in his web. Her voice faltered when she described the blackmail, the threats that had kept her silent for so long. She glanced at Jack, who sat in the gallery, his expression a mix of pain and pride. His presence grounded her, giving her the strength to continue. "I made mistakes," Lisa said, her voice trembling but resolute. "But Mark manipulated me. He preyed on my vulnerabilities, and when I tried to pull away, he used my own words against me. He's a predator, and he needs to be stopped." The room was silent as her words hung in the air. For the first time, Mark's mask slipped, his expression hardening as he leaned toward his attorney. Lisa felt a surge of confidence. She had struck a nerve. The cross-examination was brutal, Mark's lawyer attempting to paint her as complicit in his schemes. But Lisa held her ground, her responses clear and unwavering. She refused to let them twist her story, refused to let Mark's lies define her. When her testimony ended, Lisa stepped down from the stand, her legs trembling. Jack met her halfway, his hand steady on her arm. "You were incredible," he whispered. Tears filled her eyes, but she smiled for the first time in what felt like forever. "Thank you," she said, "for believing in me." The hearing ended with the judge denying Mark bail, his cold glare the only acknowledgement he gave Lisa as he was led away in handcuffs. Outside the courthouse, Lisa stood with Jack and Maggie, the weight on her shoulders finally beginning to lift. "It's not over yet," Maggie said, ever pragmatic, "but you've taken the first step." Lisa nodded, her hand slipping into Jack's. "And I'll take the next one, with you." Jack squeezed her hand, his expression softening. "We'll take them together." For the first time, Lisa believed it. The room was small and sterile, the kind of space designed to make its occupant feel insignificant. Mark sat on the opposite side of the steel table, his hands cuffed in front of him, his posture relaxed despite the gravity of the situation. His dark eyes were sharp, scanning Jack and Lisa as they entered, followed by a detective who closed the door behind them. "Jack, Lisa," Mark drawled, his lips curling into a smirk. "What a surprise." Jack didn't respond, his jaw tightening as he took the seat directly across from Mark. Lisa hesitated for a moment before sitting beside him, her fingers trembling slightly as she folded them in her lap. The detective leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. "You've got 20 minutes, he said simply, his tone firm. Mark's smirk widened as he leaned forward, his cuffs clinking against the table. "So what brings you here? Come to gloat? Or maybe you're here to thank me for making your dull little marriage interesting?" Jack's fists clenched under the table, but he forced himself to stay calm. "You've got a lot of nerve talking about our marriage," he said, his voice low and controlled, "especially considering where you are." Mark chuckled, the sound grating. "Oh, please. You think this is the end for me? A few months, maybe a year tops, and I'll be back. People like me don't stay down for long." Lisa spoke up, her voice shaking but resolute. "Not this time, Mark. We have everything. The evidence, the testimonies. You can't talk your way out of this." Mark turned his gaze to her, his smirk faltering for the briefest moment. "Lisa," he said smoothly, his tone shifting to one of feigned sincerity, "I only ever wanted to help you, to show you what you deserved." "You wanted to control me," Lisa shot back, her voice gaining strength. "You preyed on my insecurities, my mistakes, and you used them to trap me. Well, I'm not trapped anymore." Mark's expression hardened, the mask of charm slipping. "Is that what you tell yourself? That you're the victim? Don't forget, Lisa, you came to me. You opened the door." Lisa flinched, the weight of his words hitting her like a physical blow, but Jack reached over, placing a steady hand on hers. Don't listen to him, he said firmly. He's just trying to get in your head. Mark's gaze shifted to Jack, his smirk returning. Ah, Jack. The ever-loyal husband. Tell me, how does it feel knowing you were never enough? Jack leaned forward, his eyes locked on Mark's. You're right, he said quietly, his tone deadly calm. I wasn't enough, but neither were you. Because if you were, she wouldn't be sitting here with me now. Mark's smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of genuine anger. He leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. You think you've won, he said, his voice low and venomous. But this isn't over. I still have leverage. All it takes is one call and everything comes crashing down. Lisa's heart pounded, but she straightened in her chair, her voice clear and unwavering. Do it, she said. Mark blinked, caught off guard. What? Make the call, Lisa repeated. Send whatever you have, photos, recordings, whatever you think will destroy me, because I'm not running anymore, Mark. I'm done being afraid. Mark stared at her, his confidence visibly shaken. He opened his mouth to respond, but the detective stepped forward, cutting him off. That's enough, he said. We're done here. The door opened and 2 guards entered, moving to take Mark away. He stood reluctantly, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Jack and Lisa. This isn't the end, he said coldly. No, Jack replied, standing as well. It's just the beginning, for us. Mark didn't respond as the guards led him out, the sound of his cuffs echoing in the silent room. Jack turned to Lisa, his hand still resting on hers. You okay? He asked softly. Lisa nodded, tears welling in her eyes. I think so, she said, for the first time in a long time. They left the room together, the tension that had bound them for so long finally beginning to unravel. Outside, the sun was shining, the warmth of the day a stark contrast to the cold confrontation they'd just endured. Maggie was waiting for them by the car, her arms crossed and a small smile on her face. How'd it go? She asked. Better than expected, Jack said, glancing at Lisa. We're free. Lisa smiled, her hand slipping into Jack's. We are, she said, her voice filled with quiet determination, and I'm ready to start over. Maggie nodded, her expression softening. Good, because you both deserve it. As they drove away, the weight of the past finally began to lift, replaced by the promise of a new beginning. And for the first time, Jack and Lisa felt truly united, ready to face whatever came next, together. The soft hum of the dishwasher filled the kitchen as Jack leaned against the counter, sipping his coffee. The house felt different now, quieter, but not in the oppressive way it had been during the worst of the chaos. This silence was comforting, a gentle reminder that the storm had passed. Lisa entered the room, her hair pulled back loosely, and sat down at the table. She wore one of Jack's old sweatshirts, a small sign of the intimacy they were beginning to rebuild. She cradled a steaming mug in her hands, her gaze thoughtful but calm. How did you sleep? Jack asked, breaking the quiet. Lisa smiled softly, her eyes meeting his. Better than I have in months, she said. It feels lighter now, like we can finally breathe. Jack nodded, taking another sip of his coffee. We still have a long way to go, he said, his tone careful. But we'll get there. Lisa set her mug down and reached across the table, her hand brushing against his. I know I hurt you, she said quietly, and I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you if I have to. Jack placed his hand over hers, the gesture simple but full of meaning. It's not about making it up, he said. It's about moving forward, together. The words hung between them, a fragile promise they both knew would take time to fulfill. But for the first time in what felt like forever, they believed it was possible. Later that morning, they went for a walk by the river, the crisp autumn air invigorating. The path was quiet, lined with trees that had begun to shed their leaves. Jack watched as Lisa picked up a small, brightly colored leaf, turning it over in her hands with a contemplative expression. Do you remember our first hike here? She asked, looking up at him. Jack smiled, the memory surfacing easily. You complained the whole way up, he said. Said your boots were too tight. Lisa laughed, the sound light and genuine. And you carried me the last half mile because I refused to take another step. You didn't exactly give me a choice, Jack teased, his smile widening. Lisa's laughter faded into a gentle smile, her eyes soft as she looked at him. We used to be so good at this, she said, at just being together. We can be again, Jack said, his voice steady. It won't be easy, but we can. As they continued walking, the conversation flowed easily, memories intertwining with quiet moments of reflection. They talked about the past, the mistakes they'd made, and the steps they wanted to take to rebuild. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. That evening, as they sat together on the couch, Jack pulled out an old photo album. He opened it to a picture of their wedding day, the two of them beaming with joy. Lisa traced the edges of the photo with her finger, her expression a mix of nostalgia and determination. I want us to find that again, she said softly. Jack nodded. We will, he said. But it won't look exactly like this. It'll be something new, something stronger. Lisa leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. I'm okay with that, she said. As long as it's with you. For the first time in months, they felt like a team again. The wounds were still fresh, and the road ahead would be long, but they were ready to face it. Together. The sound of waves crashing against the shore filled the air as Jack and Lisa stood side by side on the beach. The sun was setting, casting hues of gold and pink across the horizon. This was where it had all started. Years ago, before life became complicated. Jack had proposed here, kneeling in the soft sand, his heart full of hope and love. Now, it felt like the right place to begin again. Lisa dug her toes into the sand, her hands tucked into the pockets of her sweater. She glanced at Jack, her expression thoughtful. I was so scared you wouldn't forgive me, she said softly, breaking the silence. Jack turned to her, the warmth in his eyes cutting through the chill of the evening. I was scared I couldn't, he admitted. But every step we've taken since then has shown me that what we have is worth fighting for. Lisa nodded, her gaze drifting back to the horizon. I've made so many mistakes, she said, her voice trembling. There were moments I thought I'd lost you forever. You almost did, Jack said honestly, his tone gentle but firm, but we found our way back. And that says something, doesn't it? She smiled faintly, the corners of her mouth lifting just enough to show her gratitude. It says you're stronger than I deserve. Don't do that, Jack said, reaching for her hand. His touch was steady, reassuring. We both made mistakes, Lisa. But we're here now, and that's what matters. For a moment they stood in silence, the sound of the waves filling the space between them. Jack could feel the weight of their journey, the pain, the heartbreak, the moments of doubt. But he also felt the promise of something new. Lisa turned to face him fully, her hands holding his tightly. Jack, she began, her voice thick with emotion. I can't promise I won't make mistakes again, but I can promise I'll never stop trying. For you. For us. Jack smiled, the sincerity in her words filling the cracks in his heart. That's all I've ever wanted, he said simply. They walked along the shore, the sand cool beneath their feet. Their conversation ebbed and flowed like the tide, sometimes light and playful, sometimes deep and reflective. They talked about their future, about the things they wanted to rebuild together. It wasn't just about fixing what was broken. It was about creating something stronger. As the last light of the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack stopped and pulled something from his pocket. Lisa looked at him curiously, her head tilting slightly. What's that? She asked. Jack opened his hand, revealing a small seashell. Do you remember this? He asked, his voice tinged with nostalgia. Lisa's eyes widened as she took the shell. This is from the night you proposed, she said, her voice soft. I thought we'd lost it. I found it in an old box when we were packing, Jack said. I held onto it because it reminded me of who we were, of what we could be again. Tears filled Lisa's eyes as she clutched the shell to her chest. Thank you, she whispered. Jack reached out, cupping her face gently in his hands. We've been through hell, he said, his voice steady, but we've made it back. And I know it won't be perfect, but I believe in us. Lisa leaned into his touch, her tears spilling over but her smile shining through. I believe in us too. Under the blanket of stars, they kissed, a kiss not of passion but of healing, of promises renewed. It was a moment that spoke of resilience, of love tested and found worthy. As they walked back to their car, hand in hand, the beach now illuminated by the soft glow of the moon, Lisa turned to Jack with a playful grin. "You know, we still have to figure out how to make those pancakes without burning them." Jack laughed, the sound echoing into the night. "One step at a time," he said, "but I'm willing to try if you are." "I'm all in," Lisa said, her voice filled with hope. "For everything." Together they walked forward, the path ahead uncertain but full of possibility. And for the first time in a long time, they were ready to face it, together. The first rays of sunlight peeked through the curtains, bathing the room in a warm, golden glow. Jack stirred awake, the softness of the morning wrapping around him like a comforting blanket. For a moment, he simply lay there, staring at the ceiling, allowing the quiet peace to settle in his chest. It was the kind of stillness he hadn't felt in years, a stillness that spoke of healing, of beginnings. Lisa was already up, her silhouette framed by the window. She held a steaming cup of coffee, her posture relaxed as she gazed outside. Jack watched her for a moment, the sight stirring something deep within him. She seemed different, lighter somehow, as though she had shed the weight of the past. "Morning," Jack said, his voice low and still rough from sleep. Lisa turned, her lips curling into a soft smile. "Good morning," she replied, crossing the room to sit on the edge of the bed. She handed him a second cup of coffee, the aroma filling the space between them. Jack sat up, taking a sip. "You've been up for a while," he noted, his tone gentle. Lisa nodded, her gaze dropping to the cup in her hands. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted, "but it wasn't the bad kind of restlessness. It was different." "Different how?" Jack asked. His curiosity piqued. Lisa hesitated, searching for the right words. "It felt like hope," she said finally, her voice soft but steady. "Like for the first time in a long time I could see a future. A good one." Jack reached out, his hand covering hers. "We'll make it good," he promised. "One step at a time." Lisa looked up at him, her eyes shining. "I know we will," she said, "because this time we're doing it together." The day unfolded slowly, deliberately. They spent the morning sorting through old boxes in the attic, laughing at forgotten trinkets and reminiscing over faded photographs. Each memory was a thread in the tapestry of their shared life, and as they wove those threads together again, the fabric felt stronger. Later they ventured into town, visiting the farmer's market for fresh produce. Jack watched as Lisa chatted with a vendor, her laughter ringing out like music. It was a small, ordinary moment, but it felt monumental. It was proof that life could be beautiful in its simplicity. As they walked through the market, hand in hand, a familiar face approached them. It was Maggie, her sharp eyes softened by a rare smile. "You two look good," she said, her tone tinged with approval. "Thanks to you," Jack replied, his gratitude evident. Maggie waved him off. "You did the hard part," she said. "I just gave you a push." Lisa stepped forward, wrapping Maggie in a heartfelt hug. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "for everything." Maggie patted her back, a rare display of affection. "Just keep moving forward," she said. "That's all the thanks I need." That evening, Jack and Lisa found themselves back on the porch, the soft glow of the string lights creating a cozy cocoon. The air was cool but pleasant, carrying the faint scent of flowers from the garden. Jack poured them each a glass of wine, the clink of the bottles a quiet toast to the day. Lisa leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the stars. "Do you think it'll always feel this good?" she asked, her voice wistful. Jack followed her gaze, the vast expanse of the night sky filling him with a sense of wonder. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I do know we'll face whatever comes." Together, Lisa turned to him, her smile radiant in the soft light. "That's all I need." As the night deepened, they sat in comfortable silence, the kind that spoke of trust and understanding. They weren't just healing, they were rebuilding piece by piece, creating a life that was theirs and theirs alone. And as the first hints of dawn began to break, painting the sky with hues of pink and orange, Jack and Lisa held on to each other, ready to face whatever the new day would bring.